Good morning, everybody. Welcome to SKC Office Hours. Happy Friday. I'm Sarah Krom, Managing Partner of SKC & Co. CPAs. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a couple of light housekeeping issues. As always, Office Hours is a recorded webinar, so it'll be available as a resource on our website. It's also going to be emailed to any registrant later in the next week, so please look out for that email. Feel free to share it, rewatch it, send it to a colleague who wasn't able to join us today. Whatever it is that you'd like to do with it, please feel free. I'm very excited to have today's guest. Deb, welcome. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
So Deb is a lead consultant and executive coach at Crothers Consulting. We met just over a little bit about a year and a half ago now. It's been fantastic. I'll get into that in a little bit, but Deb is the senior human resources and talent management executive and an executive coach specializing in working with leaders to accelerate results, drive organizational alignment, and increase effectiveness to meet emerging business challenges. She likewise possesses expertise in strategic planning, design, implementation, and facilitation of worldwide talent, organizational, and cultural initiatives. She's results-oriented in effectively consulting and partnering with all levels of senior management to drive business growth. And there's so much more I could say about you, Deb, but it's only an hour-long presentation, so I'll have to stop there.
That is okay.
But let me circle back a little bit of how we met. Like I said, it was about a year and a half ago, and Deb and I worked on a special project together for SKC. We sort of started with the theme for the year of People First at SKC for 2024, and we wanted to put something together that really spelled out what the expectations were for our team members level by level, so that it was very clear from a technical standpoint what was important to accomplish, to master, to be able to demonstrate. And so I connected with Deb through Crothers Consulting, and she helped us create not only the technical competency framework, but a behavioral competency framework, which just kind of blew my mind and made so much sense when we were talking about it and going through that process together. So we're going to use a lot of that reasoning and execution and philosophy from that special project that Deb and I did together as the basis for our discussion today. So we're going to share for everybody how to systematize and create a process for up-leveling your team across all levels. So I'm so excited, and Deb, I know that you are excited as well, because we're very sort of aligned in our philosophies on how we think about, as leaders, it's our responsibility to really enhance our team and to provide them with the resources that they need to really get to their maximum level of proficiency and execution and being the best, I call it being the best version that they can possibly be, right? Because that's different for every person. So we share this philosophy, and I'd love to kind of jump right into it with you if you're game.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Awesome. So give us some insight, if you will, on the development of our team members. What makes them stay with any specific organization and what makes them leave? Because that's a huge component of this process, right? Is talent retention, but also recruitment as well.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, SKC and Sarah, for inviting me to join you. It's really a pleasure to be with you again this late spring. So with regard to your question, when you look at the engagement data across industries, there are a number of levers that really drive commitment to stay or engagement, right? And one of the primary levers of commitment to stay is career and individual development. It's very easy for us to jump into thinking that it's all about pay, but it's way more than that. It's really about, what do I need to know? What do I need to develop? What experiences do I need to have in order for me to grow in my career? And when an organization invests time in teaching their leaders how to coach and develop people, when they take the time to document what is required at various levels within the organization in terms of knowledge, skills, capability, behaviors, and then share that with their team members, the team members have a roadmap, right? A roadmap that they are accountable for in terms of their own development. They know that their employer is committed to their growth and development, and that has an enormous impact on an individual's commitment to stay. From a recruiting perspective, it's such a great sales tool to be able to say to potential hires, here's our philosophy around grooming, growing our talent. Here's what it looks like. Let me give you a couple of examples on how I, as somebody that's interviewing you, have developed my team members and the paths they've chosen to take. So from both a retention of existing employees perspective and recruitment perspective, developing your team members is an enormous hook to get them engaged and committed to stay.
And I think when you talk about it on the recruitment side, when you have those conversations during the hiring process or in the interview, it attracts a different type of team member, right? There's a mindset around wanting to better yourself, wanting that growth, wanting that development. And then there becomes a connection. And that's almost the hook between that team member and their new organization. And it's that stickiness that not only are you getting a connection one-to-one with your manager or the HR person, because there's that care and that interest in what is going to make you a better team member, but you have to, as a team member yourself or a potential team member, you have to have that philosophy in wanting to grow and wanting to develop yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's important, I think, to talk about this process if your organization has something like this and it's part of the culture, because it tends to weed out certain people even early on in the recruiting process that may not fit with that mindset, if you will.
Yes, agreed. And I might add, I think there's a generational component as well. If you think about the generation of potential employees who are finishing school and looking for employment, this dynamic of what kind of investment will this particular employer make in my future development and growth in my career. So that's a big lever as well. And to remember that the current generation is looking for this, I think becomes very important.
Right, right, absolutely. Deb, can you talk a little bit from the leader side? What is the difference of being a proactive leader when it comes to something like this versus reactive related to the engagement of their team members?
So I have a couple thoughts related to that, and there's no priority order in the way I'm going to speak to this. All right. So the first thing that comes to my mind is a leader who himself or herself has benefited from having a mentor and or a manager who has been invested in them, and they can speak to the value of their experience in being mentored and coached, and having somebody that they could have honest conversations with about the career they're interested in, the path they want to go, and what their needs are for development. I think that, you know, so that's one thing. Let me just say that. The next thing I want to say is that I think that in my experience, there are many leaders and managers who are afraid to speak the truth to the people who are seeking development. Maybe seeking development faster than is really realistic and reasonable. And so managers who have developed a way to have a positive, motivating, informational discussion with their people about what it takes to get from where they are today to where they want to go, and speak of it in terms of here are the experiences you need to have, Here are the skills and capabilities you need to develop. Here are the behaviors you need to demonstrate. And here are the relationships you need to develop. Rather than saying, gosh, I know, Christine, you have an interest in getting getting to that director level, within 1 year, and that's going to be difficult. That kind of message and that fear that that manager may project is not going to help that employee. What's really going to help them is to have a very honest discussion around, I'm glad to hear you're motivated. That is awesome. Let's have a real pragmatic discussion about what it's going to take to get from here to here. Right? So both talking about your own experience and the value you got out of being coached and mentored, and then the leader having the courage and developing an approach to having that discussion is going to give that employee the insight around what they need to do and what they need to commit to from a development perspective. It's really it's a moment of stark reality in a way, but that's okay because at least you've given them the roadmap. And I think that roadmap is really important.
And, we'll talk a little bit before we wrap up the hour about how this is really on the team member to execute it and travel their own journey with their own career map, if you will, kind of to keep with that analogy. But the heavy lift in the beginning is really on the leadership team and the management team and creating this structure and creating this system. Because oftentimes far too often, in fact, I've seen the conversation go, what can I do to get to the level of manager? And no one's prepared with that answer. No one has a system or a process to go back to. So there's a very off the cuff answer of, oh, well, you need to work this many more hours, or you need to be able to handle this many clients on your own, or manage this much revenue on your own, or have this many reports. And so then it's constantly this game of hunt and peck. So, okay, I asked the question today and I got this answer, and then I went and did that, and then I asked it again, and then I was told I had to do something else. And so there's no clarity for the team member. And so creating this structure, I think, is important. And that heavy lift does really come on the firm management or the organizational management side of things before we can really kind of pass it to the team member to make sure that they execute it to the best of their abilities.
And when I think about the framework that we created for SKC and really understanding for each of the 5 levels within the organization, once again, it's the same thing that I just said. What are the skills and capabilities that you need to develop? What are the behaviors? What are the experiences that you need to have before you move to the next level? What are the relationships, etc.? And getting that crisp and validating it with some of the high performers within those levels is important. And oh, by the way, one question that tends not to get asked that I think can be really helpful is to ask some of those people who are in those levels as you're creating a framework like this, what do you wish you had learned? Or what experience do you wish you had had before you got promoted into this level? Right? Because once they got there, they had to figure it out versus having that experience before they get to that level. So remembering to ask that question, I think, becomes really important.
And we're going to jump into that because I want to make it clear to the audience the technical, the behavioral, and the competency frameworks that we created. But I want to give a little bit of backstory as to where we were coming from at SKC when you and I started working together. And it's sort of very easy to understand the technical framework, right? These are the skills, the knowledge that you need to be able to do to execute your task, right? In public accounting, in our firm, there's very clear tax things, accounting things, consulting knowledge that you need to have to ascend to the different levels. But what we were struggling with at the time when you and I were first introduced, Deb, was really how people were showing up to work. And I don't want to necessarily beat the generational drum too much, but we were having certain expectations as an organization of what proper office behavior looked like. And, I'm not just talking about dress code or things like that, but I'm talking about communication and, what it looks like to work collaboratively within a team. And we were frustrated with some of the new hires that we had because they didn't seem to fit into what we thought we should have as expectations of such behavior. And then it dawned on us that, well, we never told them what the expectation was when it comes to things like communication or, things like being able to work well in a group setting. It became very clear, yes, you're going to need to be able to do these types of tax returns. Yes, you're going to be able to work in, QuickBooks or what have you. But we never had a conversation with anybody, incoming, new, existing team members, any of them, about what it looked like to show up at work as a team member of SKC. And so that's really where the behavioral piece came in. And, Deb, when you explained it to me, it was like this light bulb for me, where the technical competencies are what you do within your job, and the behavioral competencies are how you do what you do, right? So it's sort of that behavior versus skills. And for us, I think we ended up putting together 7 different behaviors, behavioral competencies with definitions and things like that. But talk to me, if you will, Deb, a little bit about why it is that those behavioral competencies get overlooked or missed sometimes when we're talking about these evaluation of people's work or the framework of these competencies. Why are we always so focused on the actual technical piece, and we either forget or take for granted the behavioral side?
Well, I wish I knew the absolute response to that question, but I'll give you my point of view here. Organizations are in business to make money. And so it's a very short bridge to cross to think about, all right, what do I need to know and what do I need to do? And am I doing what I need to be doing? Right. So that's the what side of performance, right? Am I meeting my goals, meeting my objectives, period, end of story. Most of us have in our lives and our work lives experience with people who are really good at getting the results, but they also may leave a trail of broken and battered people behind them. Maybe it's not that extreme, but it's some version of that. And so I have always espoused, from a performance perspective, there are a couple pieces to this. From a performance perspective, to get really clear around how we go about doing our work. And the how side of performance, and what those behavioral competencies mean, like collaboration. What does collaboration look like at SKC, for example? In the end, they may be more important or minimally equally as important as what you do, what results you get. And quite honestly, if somebody aspires to be a senior leader, those behavioral competencies become even more important, because there are going to be other people underneath you who are doing the what, so to speak. Right? And leading is a lot about those behavioral competencies. Okay. So getting clear around what people need to accomplish and the skills and capabilities required to do that work, and how one goes about doing it, the behavioral competencies becomes important. The other piece I want to make a comment on is that the how can be connected to an organization's purpose and values. Typically, when organizations clarify what their values are, they ought to also define how those values get behaviorally represented. So it's, again, behavioral competencies. What does it look like to do what's right? If doing what's right is one of your values, what does that look like? And espousing that in the recruitment process, talking with your direct reports about that when you're coaching them and having a development discussion, And also, as a part of performance reviews, having an open discussion around the degree to which a person is demonstrating a level of proficiency as defined by the definition of those values, right? So I want to couple those behavioral competencies with the definitions of values because they really go together from a perspective of developing people and coaching them, as well as evaluating performance.
Those are great points. And I know when we worked together, you had this amazing book as a resource that we used. It was FYI for your improvement. Okay, perfect. You could, it's blurred out because your background's blurred,
I know.
but we will make sure to send not only the full title, which is for your improvement, but also the authors and the information when we send out the final video from today, the final recording, so that everybody can have it. But you know, when we started talking about the behavioral competencies and you know, creating how important that was to create as part of this project, my first question to you was, oh my goodness, where do we start? And that book was an amazing resource, but you alluded to this earlier, and it's look at your star players already in some of the roles in your organization, and what are their behaviors and what are their traits that come up always as positives in, you know, your day-to-day interaction with them, in their reviews. What are the traits that you wish certain other people had that may be falling short of expectations that are in your mind but that haven't been gotten, you know, down on paper yet formally? And that's really how we built it out. So it's very digestible to do this and go through this process. It's not at all, and of course, working with you, Deb, was not at all daunting. I think you and I probably executed this, I would say 3 to 4 months of working together.
At the most,
Yeah.
yes, at the most.
And we were able to do it. And you know, the other piece of it, and again, I loved the behavioral versus the technical competencies, but the other piece of the framework that I think for me goes above and beyond any evaluative tool that I've seen in, you know, a human resource or leadership or management type situation is the experiences, the opportunities, and the relationships. And you kind of touched on it prior, but, you know, can you expand a little bit more on this and why it's such a crucial part of the framework to deliver to your team when you roll something like this out?
Sure. So, one of the things I found after multiple decades in human resources management and working with managers around developing their people is that managers typically don't know how to have those conversations. They can talk about their own experience being developed, but many of them didn't have the greatest experience being developed either. So I want to be very intentional in my conversations with people managers around what should the topics of conversation be, right? And to me, those topics are related to where's the person at today and what are in the current role. So I always start with excellence in one's current role. What experiences do they need to have? What skills and knowledge should they have coming in? And maybe there are some additional ones that they should be developing, technical, by the way, while they're in that role, right? What are the behaviors they need to develop? So what does collaboration look like for a recent hire in accounting versus what does collaboration look like if I am, and I apologize, I don't remember the labels, but if I'm an accounting manager, right? What does it look like and who am I collaborating with, right? So there's that. And then there's then there are what relationships do I need to develop? So there are certain levels and roles where you are going to be focused predominantly internally. There are other levels and roles where you're going to be focused internally and externally. And then there are a third, which is predominantly externally. So really understanding the relationships one needs to develop over time in one's current role. And then you translate that to successive roles after that. After a person has been in a particular role at a particular level and developed what they need to develop, then the conversation shifts to what do you need to get to the next level? And importantly, what are the experiences that you're going to need to have? And I want to emphasize that because when you look at the research around adult learning and development, if you all don't know this already, 70% of learning that is retained and applied by adult learners comes from learning on the job. 20% comes from coaching and mentoring, and 10% comes through classes. And it's really easy for organizations to say, send Deb through this class. But the question is, how much does the learner retain and then apply? Versus if they're learning on the job, and being told what experiences they need to have, and working with their manager to make sure that they get those experiences over time. That's where the real learning is going to occur, and that's where the learning is going to be sustained and carried with that person throughout their career.
So there's a couple things on that I just want to follow up on. And I think that not having those experiences, opportunities, and relationships makes for an incomplete document or an incomplete process. And I learned that through working with you, because as a leader, I want to be able to create the environment that we call the no excuses environment, right? So if you come to me and you say, I'm a supervisor and I want to get to the level of manager, well, I can clearly go to the documents and say, okay, from a technical standpoint, have you achieved these things? From a behavioral standpoint, have you exhibited these behaviors consistently? And if the answer to any one of those questions or any of the subcategories within those questions is no, it allows us to continue the feedback loop and go a little bit deeper and say, well, have you taken this recommended course? Or one of the requirements for us to get to the level of manager is to teach a continuing education program to our internal team. Have you done that? Have you had some of these experiences? Have you taken the initiative to make sure that you've gone to some of these classes that we recommend, gone through some of these trainings, done some of these things, whether it's shadow a partner at a business development meeting or shadow a senior manager at a client consultative call, whatever. These are just some of the things that we have in our document. So I'm using them as tangible examples for this, but it allows there to be a full conversation of not just yes or no, you've achieved these, but maybe why have you, or more importantly, why haven't you? And that, as the team member, was on you for not embracing those experiences, opportunities, and relationships that we defined for you.
There's actually a couple things that you've just said that I'd like to key off on.
Sure.
One is that I think there is a paradigm shift between who's responsible for a person's development. And, historically, well, it's the manager, it's the organization's responsibility, but there's been a shift to no, it's the employee's responsibility, right? They have to want to make it happen. Now, having said that, I think creating a blueprint, let me just loosely call that a blueprint, which clarifies by level or by role, again, experiences, technical skills, behaviors, et cetera, becomes almost an agenda for that conversation that many managers don't know how to have, right? And by the way, that blueprint, whether it's documented or not, meaning on paper, it's evergreen. So as a person continues in their current role and is ready for their next one, not only can the manager ask the question that, have you had this experience? Excuse me. But the employee can say to their manager, hey, Sarah, I'm not sure how to get this experience. Can we have a conversation about who I ought to speak with, or can you help me figure out how to get this experience? I mean, that should be a two-way dialogue, right? So having some form of blueprint for that conversation that enables the manager and the employee to have an open discussion about what it's going to take becomes critically important.
And that's an important piece of that give and take as well, right? Because as an organization, if we want to be able to build a high quality team that's growth minded, and we want to be able to have success when it comes to retention, we need to understand that if we're going to expect our team to have these experiences, opportunities, and situations where they can build these relationships, yes, they have to go out and do them, but we have to provide those opportunities, experiences, and relationships. We have to be able to make that happen.
Yes,
So, if somebody needs to practice reviewing a 1040 as part of one of their experiences and shadow a reviewer to do that, we need to set that up. We need to schedule that. We need to make sure that the facilitation of these experiences, opportunities, and relationships are available to the team. Otherwise, it's a meaningless exercise.
agreed, 100%.
Yeah. And
100%.
and the thing that you talked about, and I love that we agree that the employee and the team member is really the driver behind this. And I think we used the analogy that, we've created the map and the roadmap at SKC through these competencies and these experiences and these opportunities, but ultimately the team member is the one driving the car. So we can
Right.
give this to you, but you've got to be the one to really execute on it and drive home. And the thing that you touched on, which was the ability to have conversations around this on an ongoing basis, I think is very important, because at SKC those conversations typically are with me as the managing partner, and larger organizations may have departments or divisions or things where there's not one leader who's handling these conversations. There's
Right.
multiple department heads or managers or what have you. And so how do we ensure, if we're the leaders of that organization, that these different managers are having the conversations at the levels down the organization that really bolster up these career maps and these competency frameworks?
So I'm wearing my HR hat here. um, I think that part of management is being a manager, highly effective manager is ensuring role clarity, setting expectations, setting goals, what's expected in a current performance cycle, developing and coaching your people, providing them with feedback, right? And assessing performance and starting the cycle all over again. I think that part of a people manager's job description has to be very clear about the expectations around coaching and developing people. And then, especially in an organization that hasn't clarified what that looks like before, I think there needs to be a discussion about and maybe documenting this is what it means to develop and coach your people. And certainly I've been a part of organizations in my career where a newly promoted people manager goes through a learning experience where they learn all about setting role clarity, setting expectations, monitoring and coaching, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's important to be able to do that. Once again, I can reinforce that there are so many people who are in people management roles who don't know how to have that they don't know how to have that conversation. And so I think it's incumbent upon company organizational leadership to say, this is part of your job and this is what it looks like. And you can take it a step further in your evaluation of people managers. You could do a mini 360 and ask their direct reports, to what degree are you getting supported from a development perspective? And here's what that looks like. Your manager sits down with you minimally twice a year, if not more, and talks with you about what you need, what experiences you need to have, skills, etc., behaviors, etc. And they get that feedback as a part of their own performance discussion. So it's it's being very clear around what's expected, supporting their development as a people manager, and holding them accountable.
So where would an organization start if they don't have something like this? Maybe they have some loose technical expectations of their team members, maybe they have nothing on the behavioral side, and they're part of this conversation this morning, and they're excited and they're motivated and they want to know where to start, but it seems incredibly daunting. What is your advice for leadership in how to take that first step?
So I think there are a number of routes that an organization can take. And part of the answer is dependent on the size of the organization. So if they've got a human resources team, a human resources management team, right? They can set an objective for one of their talented HR people to work with the leadership on beginning to build a competency framework, right? And that has a series, as you know, a series of steps that gets associated with that. If an organization does not have a human resources team, there are consultants like Crothers Consulting who can work with you and walk you through that exact process. Okay. Now, as you've heard us discuss over the course of the last 40 minutes, there are multiple pieces to this. Having a competency framework as a starting point has legs and can connect to recruiting. And what do you say about your development commitment? Has a connection to culture. Let's make sure that as a part of the competencies, we're defining the values if we haven't already done so, right? Of course, to coaching, there's a link, and retention, and performance management, there's a link, right? And so all of those pieces can be built out and they're all integrated. So again, I think that if it doesn't exist and you have a human resources team, I would go to one of those team members and ask them what it would take to begin that process and what are all the pieces to make that happen. Alternatively, please feel free to reach out. I mean, I know that you could provide some guidance and advice, but I'm hopeful that you would say, talk to Crothers Consulting.
Yeah. I mean, I've
And
only gone through it once with you, and I
I
know
know.
enough to be dangerous, but I leaned on you a lot when we did this project
I guess
together.
what people need to know is that the likelihood of having the answers, having the knowledge to build a competency framework for one's organization is probably already embedded in the leadership's minds, but it does take an organized discussion that is very crisp around what are the things we need to know in order to begin to build the draft that they need to review, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And you
And
talked a little bit too about, I call it the concept of benchmarking, where you take your superstar player at each level and you start to break down, well, what do they do in their day-to-day and what are their behaviors? And it's not fully taking that person as representative of each level, because I think there's always room for improvement and,
or diversity. There's room for diversity,
correct,
right?
correct. Better way to say it. Yeah, absolutely. But that's a starting point as well, is okay, let's break down who's the best player in each of these areas and start to construct something as a framework that way.
We use a template called a success profile, which has on it a whole series of questions that goes through, in this particular, using your example, if you've got a star player, what's the education they had, right? What leadership roles did they have when they were in school? What do they do really well from a technical capability perspective? What about behavioral competencies? What certifications do they have? Oh, by the way, for them at their level, how, I'm trying to think of the way to say this. What are their behaviors as they relate back to the values? What are they demonstrating, right, at their level? Now, maybe it's not any different between one level and another, but it might be. And so it'd be interesting to see for a person at a mid-level, how are they demonstrating doing what's right?
And what's interesting too, if you go through this exercise and then you're very happy with the end result and you think it really captures what you want it to capture, and then you overlay your existing team on it, right? Because you roll this out and the expectation is we're now implementing this, and you've got people who have titles that obviously fall within now defined categories, and they may not be achieving what their title now implies that they should be
Or
achieving.
demonstrating,
Right.
correct.
What is your advice if that becomes the situation? I assume that you're going to take us back to the conversation.
Yeah, I was just about to say, you need to have a private conversation, right? And you need to have a private conversation with that individual and really gauge their investment in closing whatever gaps exist. From a behavioral competency perspective, my belief is that that is critically important. From a technical competency perspective, if somebody has risen to a very senior level and they haven't had a particular experience, or they haven't developed that particular competency, I can only assume that they are not, and you correct me if I'm wrong, they're not accountable for guiding that, whatever that technical competency, what the work is associated with that technical competency. It's a tricky dynamic, because is the person willing to go back and have that experience? Big question mark. And so I think those are very, those are real one-on-one conversations with people.
And I think that's the next step of importance to master, right? Is now that we've created these amazing documents that provide the system and provide the information to our team members, these documents now need to evolve into being part of the review, assessment, conversations that I'm hopeful everyone has with their team members already. And then also into the raise or the salary calculation for individuals. And Deb, how is it that you advise making that shift into, okay, we've created these documents now, we've rolled them out to our team. Now there has to be an element of, I'll say math because I'm looking at it from a formulaic standpoint, but now we're going to be reviewing our team members on these expectations and these competencies. And this is how your raise is going to be defined once we go through that process.
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding your question, Sarah. Is it, let me just ask, can you simplify your question just so that I make
Sure.
sure that I'm answering it?
Sure. So we create these competency
Yeah.
frameworks, we roll them out to our team. How we did it at SKC is we had each team member self-evaluate, and then the leadership team did their own evaluation of each individual, and we had a conversation comparing what their self-assessment was versus how we saw them. But the very next step then becomes, this is now an evergreen document that we will revisit every year as you move up the ladder, so to speak. And it's tied to your annual evaluation and your annual salary increase. And how do we make that connection internally with our team?
So, okay. And this, in some respects, actually, so this connects to a question that one of our guests is posing, right? And that is, and let me just clarify, that is making sure that that competency framework is not a checklist where somebody checks it off and they believe, well, I've done everything, I've had these experiences, I'm demonstrating these skills, boom, I should get promoted. And therein lies a bit of a danger. I think there needs to be, I would tie it back to the philosophy, right? So thank you, Francine, for your question. I think it's a really important question too. I think you have to tie it back to the philosophy. First of all, I think that, and this is my philosophic perspective, okay? First of all, in order to learn all the lessons that are to be learned in a particular role, a person's going to need to go through several business cycles in that role, because each business cycle is going to bring forward new ideas, new challenges, new problems that need to be worked through, that are worked through with the capabilities that people are learning and building, right? And so getting really clear around, you need to expect to go through several business cycles before we consider you for next role. It's not just checking those boxes, right? On top of that, there are organizations that get really clear for each of those competencies. What does meeting expectations look like? What does exceeding expectations or exceeding the proficiency level look like, right? And what does, not meeting the expectations or proficiency level look like? And then they have a range associated with bonuses and merit increases, et cetera, and they apply their decision making to that range, right? So it depends. By the way, that is an additional layer of work to get that clarity. But I do think minimally the conversation around, are they meeting the expectations we have, or are they exceeding it, and how are they exceeding it? And if they are, then perhaps the bonus and the merit increase is going to be at the higher end of that range for that role, for that level. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
It does. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's important too with your concept of going through several business cycles is because we need to be able to have you demonstrate the learning. And you talked before about the
And apply
70,
it.
exactly. You talked about the 70, the 20, and the 10. And, if you take one of the courses that's recommended on the checklist and check it off, but then you go through a project that requires you to use skills that you've learned and you don't demonstrate those skills, or if we're going through preparation of a tax return and you're getting review points and you're not applying what you've learned from those review points to subsequent tax returns that you prepare in the public accounting realm, you're not learning what we need you to learn to excel. And
You haven't learned. Absolutely.
we've had conversations internally where we say, well, this individual graduated so-and-so year, they got their CPA exam passed and is licensed, and they've, been in various different firms for 7 years. Well, that doesn't mean that that person has 7 years of experience. They may have 7 years of a first year experience 7 times. And I think that's important to distill and understand about your people is, they may have been in their field for 10 years, 15 years, however long it is, but are they consistently growing each and every year? And
Absolutely.
I'll use this will be my word, and earning their next level of years of being in the field, or are they just sort of rinse and repeating every business cycle, as you say?
Right. Right. So I think as new hires come on board, as organizations, we have an accountability to share with those new hires how this all works, right? And to get really clear, set the expectations early, I guess is what my point is, right? You need to go
Absolutely.
through several cycles. You need to apply these learnings. We need to see you apply them successfully, etc.
So one of the pre-submitted questions with registration, I think is an interesting one, and I wanted to bring it up before we closed out.
Sure.
And it's the idea of what to do in a situation where you've got subcontractors and maybe not employees, and how do you set something like this up for success if the folks that you work with day in and day out aren't your employees, and you can't necessarily mandate them to go through something like this? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So a couple of initial thoughts. First of all, I'm a person who believes in being transparent. So if somebody is doing work on behalf of my organization, I want to share with them what the expectations for, not only for performance and results, but also what we expect of our people. when they're working for me, during the time that they're working for me, they're representing my organization. So my expectation is behaviorally, capability wise, etc., they are in line with, poor choice of words, they are operating in the way that we expect our employees to operate. Okay. Translation, they can see the competency framework. Certainly, we're going to want people who are willing to demonstrate the capabilities that we expect of our own people. And we're going to leverage that in order to make a decision around who we're going to bring in the organization, even if they're subcontractors. Now, having said that, not everyone has the same ambition or aspirations from a development perspective. And if a person is happy with operating at a level 2 level, and they're demonstrating everything that we expect of them, and they're doing it well, and they get good feedback, I'm happy that they're in the role, and I'm delighted that they want to remain in the role, right? So it really depends. Again, I would be transparent. Here are our expectations. And also, I don't expect that every single person who is a subcontractor aspires in the same way that perhaps many of our employees would aspire. And that's okay, as long as they are operating in the way that we expect them to operate.
And I think it goes back to, you really get clear on who it is you want within your organization, either in the role of employee or in the role of subcontractor, because either way, they're representing you as an organization.
Right.
And are they in alignment, again, regardless of employee or subcontractor, are they in alignment with your values? Are they in alignment with your culture overall? If something like this is built into your culture, you could easily weed out perhaps certain employees or subcontractors who don't
Sure.
buy into this, or want to go through this exercise. I think it's very telling if you're in a position with, again, either an employee or a subcontractor, where you're forcing them to go through this exercise or forcing them to go through this process, because you want something like this so embedded in your culture that you've got the folks that are excited about it on the team and want to really embrace it and fully dive in.
Again, to me, it all comes down to that subcontractor is operating on behalf of your organization. So taking the time and the care to assess them up front along all the things that you said, all the lines, right? Being transparent around, should they wish to develop, here's what we tell our people, and then it's still on their shoulders, right?
Mm-hmm. They're the ones driving the car.
Right, absolutely.
So Deb, as we wrap up, and I think this has been a great conversation, and I so appreciate you joining us, but I want to talk a little bit about because so much of the execution of this is really around conversation and being appropriate in the conversation that you have. You used the term courageous earlier, for the leaders or the managers to be courageous in having those sometimes difficult conversations. I want to focus a little bit on where, as people managers, to use your term, we're spending our time, because I've seen, and I've probably been guilty of this before, I know I have, where we're spending more of our time with our underperforming folks and not enough time with our superstars, who quite honestly really deserve more of our attention. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Um, yes, I guess the first thing I would say is you're not alone. That spending time with our underperformers is part of our job as people managers, but we have to preserve time for our meets expectations and exceeds expectations performers, because they're going to be tomorrow's leaders and they need us as much as those underperformers do. And by the way, not all, some of those underperformers may not be the right people for your organization. You still have to follow certain rules and practices and policies around coaching them and developing them and performance managing them. So please continue to do that. But remember that your meets expectations and exceeds expectations performers, they're the ones that are really motivated. Invest in them. And one of the companies that I used to work with for 17 years, we used to have a mini bonus for people managers who were net exporters of talent, meaning they developed their people so effectively that they became ready to move to another place in the organization at a higher level. I loved that concept, being a net exporter of talent within the organization. So maybe think about what that might look like within your organizations, right?
Absolutely.
That is a high performing developer of talent.
Absolutely. And our superstars are intuitive, and they know where you're distracted and where you're not focusing on them, and that will only hurt the overall organization. So always important to keep that top of mind. Deb, any final thoughts to share with the audience before we close for today?
Other than much appreciation for the partnership with Crothers Consulting. Obviously people like myself and Francine Estrig, a colleague of mine at Crothers, we're really passionate about this work. And we've seen the benefits of it within countless client organizations. SKC has been a delight to work with. And it's funny, I get chills thinking about people being so excited about their career, right? And about being developed. I love seeing that in people. And we want to see more.
Absolutely. And, SKC has about 25 employees. So this is appropriate for organizations of all sizes.
Yes.
And it really is a differentiator, not only from a retention, but from a recruiting standpoint as well, because you've got this infrastructure in place and you've got this people first mindset of development. And that, I think, is really what so many people, regardless of generation, quite honestly, are searching for and are missing a little bit nowadays.
Absolutely.
Well, Deb, again, I always enjoy spending time with you. Thank you so much for
Likewise.
joining us this morning. I want to
Pleasure.
thank the audience for being with us. As always, if you have any ideas for topics of office hours, please let us know. We want to make these as valuable for you as we possibly can. Have a wonderful rest of your day and have a safe and happy weekend. Thank you all so much.